This lecture will focus on what happens after a behavior occurs. In behavior analysis, we call these stimulus changes after a behavior consequences. In our everyday language, people often use the word consequences to mean something negative that happens. This is not how we use it in ABA. It only means what happens after. Keep this in mind as we continue in our discussion. Let's just reiterate one more time. In ABA, consequences do not mean something bad or unpleasant. It just means something that happens immediately after a behavior. That's it. One of the main things that happen after a behavior is called reinforcement. Reinforcement is a process by which a consequence that follows a behavior strengthens the behavior. A behavior can increase in strength by increasing in frequency, duration, or magnitude. A reinforcer is the stimulus that is introduced or changed after the behavior occurs. Let's review that quickly. Reinforcement is the process by which a consequence that follows a behavior increases or strengthens that behavior. A reinforcer is the thing that was presented or changed after the behavior occurs. If you say hi to someone and they smile back and say hello, and then you say hi to more people after that, we can say that reinforcement occurred. How did reinforcement occur? We can assume that the person smiling and saying hi as a consequence to your behavior functioned as a reinforcer and increased your greeting behavior. The likelihood that something will reinforce a response depends on the degree a person values or prefers it. This is determined by the quantity, quality, and the current level of motivation. What we find reinforcing, or what will function as a reinforcer, is not static. It can change from day to day and even moment to moment. There are a class of reinforcers that do not require any learning to establish them as reinforcers. These include things like food, water, breathing air, sleep, comfortable temperatures, scratching an itch, etc. These things are also called primary reinforcers. Most of these will increase in value if the person has been deprived of them for some time. For example, eating will be more valuable if you hadn't had any food in days. Taking a drink of water will be more valuable if you haven't had anything to drink for a few hours. Conversely, there are many stimuli that have become reinforcing through learning processes. These are called conditioned reinforcers or secondary reinforcers. These reinforcers have been associated with primary unconditioned reinforcers throughout our life and have now taken on reinforcing properties themselves. The best example of a conditioned reinforcer is money. As an infant or young child, we would not necessarily find a $100 bill reinforcing. It has no value for us. But as we get older, we learn that money is associated with access to all sorts of reinforcing things. You give $1 and you get a soda. It's been paired with other reinforcers and thus becomes desirable itself. Natural reinforcers happen spontaneously as a normal part of our everyday activities. You put on a nice outfit and someone stops you to compliment you. You walk into a dark room and you flip the light switch and it becomes bright. Program reinforcers are contrived or planned and are meant to encourage behaviors. Some of the examples of these would be paychecks, bonuses, extra credit assignments, door prizes, etc. When we speak of reinforcement, we need to realize that there are two different types of reinforcement, positive and negative. Both work to increase or strengthen a behavior. The positive in positive reinforcement should be considered in the mathematical sense, not in an emotional sense. Positive in this sense does not necessarily mean good or nice. It just means added or increased, like a positive number in math. Positive means that a stimulus has been added or increased in response to the behavior, and that the behavior is then strengthened. If you put $1 in the soda machine and get a soda, the next time you are thirsty, you'll probably do that again because your money-giving behavior was reinforced by getting the soda that you wanted. Negative reinforcement means something is taken away or reduced and the behavior that follows is strengthened. The negative and negative reinforcement has nothing really to do with bad or unpleasant. It just means something is subtracted, just like a negative number in math. A common example is the annoying sound that comes on in your car before you put your seatbelt on. Our seatbelt buckling behavior is increased because when we do this, that horrible sound is taken away. Another example would be taking aspirin for a headache. Taking aspirin takes away the discomfort of the headache. And so in the future, if we have a headache, we will take aspirin again. Positive reinforcers vary from person to person and from day to day within the individual. But we can categorize some of the most common types in these broad areas. Tangibles, which would be things like food and gifts. Activities, which would include things like trips, watching TV, going to a sporting event. Social reinforcers, which would include praise, recognition, hugs. Feedback, which would be things like information on our performance. Tokens, which are symbols used to obtain other reinforcers, like money or poker chips. And covert reinforcers, which are things we do internally, like self-praise or self-talk. I'm sure you could list many more in each of these categories that you find reinforcing, and probably find a few on this list that are not reinforcing at all. This is an important aspect to understanding reinforcers. Just because someone thinks something would be of value or desirable to someone doesn't mean that it actually will. Let's recall that negative reinforcement strengthens behavior and only has to do with removing or reducing some sort of condition following the behavior. Negative reinforcement strengthens behaviors that reduce aversive conditions. Aversive conditions means something that is unpleasant, undesirable, uncomfortable, etc. Aversive conditions can be overt, like annoying sounds or bad smells, or they can be covert, like feelings of anxiety, pain, or sadness. We learn to escape aversive situations when they occur, and we also learn to avoid aversive situations when we can predict their occurrence. Let's think back to the annoying car sound when the seatbelt is unbuckled. We learn to escape that aversive condition by buckling our seatbelt. The buckled seatbelt turns off, removes the aversive condition of the noise. We may also learn to avoid that aversive condition by beginning to buckle our seatbelt even before we turn the car on. We learn to avoid the aversive condition altogether by engaging in a particular behavior. So how can we identify whether something will be a reinforcer? Since we can only know if something will be a reinforcer if its presentation after a behavior increases or strengthens that behavior in the future, what we typically do first is try to identify potential reinforcers, those items or activities that might be valuable to a person. We can do this through direct assessment or indirect assessments. Direct assessments can include observation of the individual in the natural environment to see what they tend to gravitate towards or spend their time doing. It could also include direct testing of different stimuli to see what that person selects in a given situation. In indirect assessments, we might use things like interviewing the person to see what their likes and dislikes are, or maybe interviewing family members. We could also give checklists where the person selects items or activities that they enjoy. Identifying potential reinforcers is one of the most important components involved in interventions aimed at changing and/or teaching behaviors. A new behavior is best if it is reinforced immediately. The longer you wait to deliver a reinforcer after the behavior has been admitted, the less potent that reinforcer will be, and the lower the chance that reinforcement will have actually occurred. A new behavior is also developed best if it is reinforced after every response. Remember, we learn to engage in behaviors because those behaviors have been reinforced. Reinforcement is the process by which a consequence is delivered following a behavior, and that behavior increases or strengthens in the future. If we aren't reinforcing the behavior, there's no possibility for that behavior to be strengthened.